Good evening there. My name is Enrique Ponce Goyochea, and I am a DBA candidate at Hallford University. I am hereby submitting this research in fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Business Administration. In this sense, the title of my research here is The Shadow Gold Standard, Assessing the Viability of an Updated Version of a Sound Commodity Currency. So let me first begin by highlighting the key relevance of my research to the fields of business and management. On the one hand, from a macroeconomic perspective, the return to a sound commodity standard would be highly relevant for the advancement of a purely free business market environment. On the other hand, when zooming in through a microeconomic perspective, they would also be highly relevant by extension to the analysis of individual investment projects, in particular when assessing their profitability and viability. Regarding the outline of my research, in the first chapter, I will be focusing on the monetary determinants of business cycles from the enlightening perspective of the Austrian business cycle theory. Then, moving on to the second chapter, I will be analyzing the key inconsistencies of fractional reserve commercial banking and therefore unmasking this inflationary practice as the key monetary determinant of business cycles. Then, moving on to the third and final chapter, I will be outlining the monetary proposal itself, which will be aimed at resetting the original link between the US dollar as the key worldwide reference reserve currency and gold as the underlying monetary commodity. And I will be assessing this subject matter through the analysis of the shadow gold price, that is to say, the actual amount of US dollars being backed up by actual hard cash reserves in terms of gold. So let me now begin with the first chapter of my research, throughout which I will be analyzing the key monetary determinants of business cycles through the perspective of the Austrian business cycle theory, which was first outlined by Ludwig von Mises and later perfected even further by Murray Rothbard, among other great scholars. In this sense, this cyclical approach describes a boom-bust cycle in which there is an unsustainable boom leading to an inevitable subsequent bust. And this happens because this unsustainable boom is fueled through monetary inflation, that is to say, the unbacked issuance of fiduciary media over and above the stock of actual hard cash reserves. This leads to lowering interest rates below their natural free market levels, that is to say, their level stemming from time preferences for present over future goods. This is a key concept, highly relevant here, the concept of time preferences, because when it comes to the allocation of money, there's essentially two options. On the one hand, one can allocate them to savings and investment, and on the other hand, one can allocate it to consumption, that is to say, present consumption. So in this sense, lower time preferences imply channeling these liquid resources, that is to say, cash or money, mostly into savings and investment, and therefore deferring consumption mostly towards the future. Whereas higher time preferences imply channeling those liquid resources mostly to present consumption as opposed to savings and investment. Hence, lower time preferences are the key to lower interest rates, which denote resources that are being freed up, that is to say, liquid resources in terms of hard cash. This represents a flow of liquid resources being freed up in the present to be channeled into business investment projects. Hence, when interest rates are being lowered, but not through this mechanism of time preferences that I just explained, but instead by artificially storing monetary inflation, these artificially lower interest rates tend to distort key profitability benchmarks regarding the assessment of the viability and profitability of investment projects. That is to say, for instance, they tend to inflate the net present value because the lower the interest rates, the higher the value of those future cash flows linked to those investment projects precisely. Hence, this leads to asset misallocation and malinvestment. And at some point during the lifespan of these unsustainable investment projects, when interest rates inevitably end up shooting back up as a result of those underlying higher time preferences, these investment projects are therefore proven to be unprofitable and unsustainable, which is why they must inevitably be liquidated before completion. And this results in a credit crunch, leading to a recession and often an even deeper depression. So this is the key essence of the Austrian business cycle theory. Now this is highly relevant as opposing to some inconsistencies stemming from the mainstream approach on the other hand. For instance, the Keynesian approach tend to misinterpret this cyclical perspective by mistaking the concept of time preferences, which I just explained here, with the concept of utility of money. This leads them to approach this subject matter regarding business cycles from a highly misleading perspective. For instance, they tend to ascribe the causes for the fall in the demand for money, that is usually a characteristic of recessions. They tend to ascribe this fall in the demand for money to an increase in savings, which clearly makes no sense at all, because just like I explained here throughout this first chapter, an increase in savings is the result of lower time preferences. That is to say, lower time preferences which imply that money, hard cash, liquid resources are being channeled in the present mostly to savings and investment as opposed to present consumption. Whereas on the other hand, a fall or an increase in the demand for money is closely linked to utility of money and has nothing to do with time preferences whatsoever. That is to say, an increase in the utility of money leads to an increase in cash balances and therefore, as a result, an increase in the demand for money. Whereas on the other hand, a fall in the demand for money, which usually happens during a recession, is a result of a decrease in the utility of money, which therefore leads to a decrease in cash balances. So this enlightening Austrian approach to business cycles explains the key essence of the backstage of these cyclical fluctuations, as well as the key relevance of interest rates and time preferences as the underlying cause of any kind of movement linked to the evolution of such interest rates, and therefore its consequences on the analysis of the profitability and viability of investment projects as such. This leads me to the topic of the second chapter of my research, which is fractional reserve commercial banking and the inconsistencies stemming from this inflationary practice, which unmasked as the key monetary determinant of the business cycles that I just analyzed through this Austrian business cycle theory approach. So in this sense, fractional reserve commercial banking is indeed an inherently inflationary practice because it fuels monetary inflation through the unbacked issuance of fiduciary media over and above the amount of hard cash reserves. That is to say, fractional reserve commercial banking tends to fuel the kind of monetary inflation that leads to the artificially distorting moves in interest rates by lowering them below their actual free market levels as denoted by underlying time preferences. Besides, fractional reserve commercial banking is also inconsistent and unsustainable from both an accounting and a financial perspective because of the time structure of the commercial bank assets and their liabilities. That is to say, there is a maturity mismatching here between the time structure of commercial banks' assets and their liabilities. Why? Because on the one hand, commercial bank assets consist mostly of loans of different maturities over time, either on a short-term basis or on a long-term basis. Whereas, on the other hand, commercial bank liabilities consist mostly of deposits, mostly on-demand deposits. That is to say, checking account deposits and savings deposits, which are contractually susceptible to being redeemed at any time on demand, thereby making their time structure inherently shorter than that of commercial banks' assets. Hence, this leads to an inherent risk of a bank run, which would expose these fractional reserve commercial banks as inherently insolvent from an accounting and a financial perspective. So here's another interesting challenge. This time it's now coming from outside the Austrian School of Economics, but mostly from the inside, from the free bankers themselves, because there's an interesting debate between Rothbardian followers, such as myself, advocating for 100% reserve banking versus free bankers advocating for this inflationary practice of fractional reserve commercial banking that I just described in the second chapter. On the one hand, these free bankers appear to disregard the fact that these deposits, that is to say, constituting the liabilities of commercial banks, these deposits that are contractually on demand are actually not future goods but present goods in itself. Why? Because the bank customers are not actually abstaining from redeeming those deposits at any time on demand because they are contractually entitled to do so. Hence, these deposits indeed constitute not loans, that is to say, not future goods, but present goods, that is to say, money, liquid resources, and therefore present goods. Because they seem to be mistaking this deposit for loans, which would make them future goods because of the time element, essentially. This is not a credit transaction because the key element, theoretically and empirically speaking, to any credit transaction implies an exchange of a present for a future good. But here, we are talking about present goods exclusively. That is to say, any bank customer who deposits their money throughout a checking account or savings account, they're not actually resigning from their right to redeem it at any time on demand because they are contractually entitled to do so. This unveils the inconsistency of the free bankers' approach advocating for this inflationary practice. So this also exposes the fact that the lower the reserve ratio, mathematically speaking, as long as it is lower than 100%, the lower it is and the lower it tends to zero, the higher is the money multiplier, which is precisely mathematically the inverse of the reserve ratio. And therefore, the more this reserve ratio tends to zero, the lower it is, the higher the money multiplier is, and the closer it is to tending to infinity, which would imply outright monetary hyperinflation and the ultimate destruction of the currency, because inflation is always and anywhere a monetary phenomenon. This is theoretically and empirically proven to be true. This, in particular, also highlights the relevance of the return to a sound commodity standard, which I will be addressing right now throughout the third and final chapter of my research. So, what I am proposing here is resetting the link between the US dollar as key worldwide reference reserve paper currency to gold as the historically classic underlying monetary asset, with reference to which all paper currencies, starting by the US dollar and the British pound sterling, for instance, have been originally defined. That is to say, the US dollar has originally been defined as a weight in terms of gold. For instance, by virtue of the Gold Standard Act of 1900, a US dollar used to be defined as 1/20.67 of a troy ounce of gold. That is to say, for every single troy ounce of gold, you had 20.67 US dollars. So, in this sense, gold is the underlying monetary asset from which the US dollar ultimately derives its purchasing power, that is to say, its exchange value. And here, there's another highly important aspect to outline, that another challenge from the inside of the Austrian School of Economics is posed by the Hayekian proposal for private competing currencies, as opposed to this type of proposal that I'm outlining here, which is a Rothbardian proposal, that is to say, based on Murray Rothbard insight on this subject matter, which implies linking the US dollar, that is to say, an already established currency, to gold as the key ultimate monetary asset in itself. And this is highly relevant because I can answer to this challenge posed by Hayekian followers by pointing out that they are in fact disregarding the Ludwig von Mises monetary regression theorem, which clearly explains how any currency should be susceptible to being traced up backwards to a point in time at which it had use value previously to becoming a medium of exchange, as to say, previously to actually acquiring some exchange value and becoming a currency in itself, money. Because money is defined as a generally accepted medium of exchange. And according to Karl Menger's view on the origins of money, a currency emerges from the inner workings of the free market itself by virtue of its superior marketability with respect to other assets initially performing as media of exchange as well. When this medium of exchange becomes generally accepted and outperforms all other assets, competing assets, by virtue of its superior marketability, then it becomes money in itself, that is to say, a generally accepted medium of exchange. So in this sense, it is also highly relevant to point out that the Hayekian proposal for private competing currencies would therefore contradict somehow the quintessence of this Misesian monetary regression theorem. Why? Because those competing private currencies would lack the feature of general acceptance, which is the defining feature of money, just as I explained here, because they would in fact not have emerged from the inner workings of the free market itself, but it would be similar to fiat currencies that are imposed by central banks through legal tender laws. They will emerge just out of the blue. They will have no history or track record of ever having been used as generally accepted media of exchange. So in this sense, the US dollar as worldwide reference reserve currency already has a proven and successful track record as such as reference currency. Hence, its link to gold as the historically accepted monetary commodity, outperforming all other commodities, for instance silver, in doing so, in performing as money, would also highlight the relevance of linking the US dollar back to gold on the basis of the shadow gold price, which is the actual amount of US dollars outstanding, that is to say US dollars in existence, circulating, with respect to the actual amount of gold in hard cash reserves as denominated in terms of troy ounces. That is to say, the shadow gold price is indeed the actual amount of US dollars being backed up by each and every single one troy ounce of gold being held as a reserve. So why the US dollar? Just like I said before, because it is the worldwide reference reserve currency. And why link it back to gold? Because gold is a monetary commodity in classical terms which has historically outperformed all other commodities in performing as money successfully by virtue of its superior marketability as such. And this emerges from the inner workings of the free market itself. And this is the key relevance and the fundamentals, both theoretically and empirically speaking, to my monetary proposal, consisting of returning to a sound commodity standard by linking the US dollar back to gold through the shadow gold price, reflecting the actual scarcity of this precious metal, gold, with respect to the outstanding amount of US dollars in circulation. This would tend to enhance the purchasing power of the US dollar, consolidating it as a real currency backed up by a sound commodity like gold. And this would imply the pure application of a free market theoretical and empirical framework to the fields of money and banking, which at the same time would be highly relevant by extension to the fields of business and management. And this is essentially the essence of my proposal here, the proposal that inspired my doctoral research that I am hereby submitting, and that has been developed throughout the years for my presentations at international academic conferences worldwide, which is why I am highly honored to be submitting it here in fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Business Administration. Thank you very much for watching my presentation here. It has been a pleasure. Thank you and good evening.